Okay, we're live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week is actually going to be our last in-person discussion for a while now, because welcome to global pandemic. And that's also what the topic is tonight. So we're talking about, we've talked about in here how various kinds of economic shocks can interact with basic income, or what happens if you don't have a basic income, that kind of thing. We've talked about asteroid impacts, and that would be true if we had an asteroid impact or something like that. Well, now we have something that's similar in some ways, and we're going to talk about it. Some of us read an article from Wired titled "COVID-19 will mark the end of affluence politics" by Matt Stoller. I'll start by going around the room. Initial thoughts on the current situation, COVID-19 coronavirus outbreak, and basic income. Actually, I want to mention also that a lot of basic income supporters are using this as an opportunity to, tweet hashtag UBI stimulus and things like that. So there's like, oh, we need an emergency basic income, or even a disaster income, as some of the articles that Richard has shared in the Facebook group have been calling it. Initial thoughts. Go ahead, Nick.
Well, I haven't had a chance to read the article, this article or those articles, but I think it is. I was just seeing a headline as I came in here that Italy, and the headline was something like Italy announces it's going to stop all economic activity or something like that, which can't really be. Doesn't sound like it can be quite right, but yeah, I mean, we seem like there's a really good chance we're heading into a really big disruption to the economy, and like the ways a lot of people make their money is going to be really severely impacted. Individuals, businesses, other organizations, and without having benefited the article, it makes a lot of sense to me that a basic income would, help sort of stop the domino effect of a small business no longer able to pay its employees, and then that guy can't buy anything, that can have such a scary, vicious cycle for the economy.
Yeah. Steve?
What I take away from the article is that we all get to be poor now. We basically nobody, even rich people, can get the basics of life, of survival at the moment.
Certain things.
Depending on how bad you get the disease,
right.
You might not be able to get off the shelf the things that you need.
Yeah. Elizabeth.
Similar to what Nick said, that given a lot of people aren't traveling as much, aren't going out as much, like a lot. Gig economy workers are the folks who are most hit, and folks who are working in like food service and stuff. But there's sort of continuing ripple effects of there's a lot of less economic activity and sort of downscaling of how much labor we actually need given the consumer demand for stuff, and that's really scary because that's how people get their money. And so if there were a system where it was okay, great, you are already getting enough money from the government, you can, maybe you're ordering your food on Instacart or something, but you at least have money to buy food or to buy your prescription meds and not be cool, so need my anti-asthma medicine, but also have been waiting tables and have no tips because nobody wants to leave their house.
Yep. Yeah. Richard.
Well, people need to shop outside of the house for many of the things that they need, and people don't want to go outside of their house, and as Elizabeth was saying, the Peapod workers or whatever, they don't want to go to your house. So how do you get the things that you need?
Yeah, these are all important questions. And my mom says that she's heard of the idea of just giving people money, even from CNN pundits. It might be the perfect time to do UBI per force. And I want to kind of remind people that there have been times and places in history, like not so long ago, in response to the 2008 crash, where the government just sent out checks to people to kind of like get things going again. And she says disruption in food supply shortages, kind of a repeat of the Depression in its manifestation. We're supposed to be preparing like for a storm, but not sure how. Government definitely needs to provide relief, maybe not sure what. And there's this common trope on like macroeconomics Twitter where anytime you're talking about like a big something that really affects the economy, suddenly is it a supply shock or is it a demand shock? And I think in the case of something like this, it's both, right? There are certain things that people need a lot more of, or maybe they don't need a lot more, hand sanitizer, but they want to buy a lot more hand sanitizer. So that's kind of like a demand shock, and then there's certain in one direction, and then in the other direction, there's certain things people don't want to buy anymore. People don't really want to go to the movies. They don't want to get on airplanes. So that's kind of the other direction. So depending on what you're talking about, it can affect demand in different directions. And then the same thing for supply. So if workers aren't able to go to their jobs, if maybe they were working at a movie theater, not such a big deal. If they were working, providing, producing food that everybody is going to still need, even if we're in a global pandemic, then, that is a bigger deal. So there's kind of, it's not uniform how it affects the economy. There's different demand shocks and different supply shocks depending on what we're talking about. So it's kind of like this really complicated thing. In terms of basic income, it's also an interesting question. We can imagine a world in which we already had a basic income, as I'd love to do. And then if you're in that situation, and then a global pandemic hits, and then suddenly the economy is producing a lot less stuff, then kind of what Steve said is true, that we have to, everyone has to get by being a little bit poorer. If you're in a world without basic income, like the world we're actually in, we're using the financial sector in place of basic income. We're propping up consumer spending, using massive amounts of private sector debt. So now you've got this whole kind of house of cards that's waiting to collapse. And a lot of things could cause it to collapse. Just random stuff in financial markets could cause it to collapse, hypothetically. But now you've got this very specific thing. So the impact on the economy of coronavirus is going to be potentially a lot greater than it would be if we had something like a basic income already in place, because now you've got a collapse of the financial sector, and then that creates all these kinds of secondary effects on the economy and on the markets and that kind of thing. So there's kind of like a lot to dig into here. Bethany, do you have initial thoughts on coronavirus, basic income, economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think you've summarized some of what I was going to say, but I guess I've been thinking a lot about the distinction between like hits it has that are unavoidable in any kind of system, like certain people can't go to factories and like do things there,
right.
And that's a real hit on like our ability to produce things for people. And then other kinds of influences that might be mitigatable in a different system. So the financial market effect is one, and we were also talking about like how in the service sector, the demand for going to restaurants is going down along with the supply of people to work in the restaurants. So that's not like as bad objectively as not being able to produce like necessary food or something like that. But it's bad in these other ways, partly because people really rely on those wages to then go and buy their actual food. So that's one, again, that like might be mitigatable a bit with a basic income or a different system, as opposed to just the raw effect on like production and productive capacity. So I've been trying to think through like the different levels of kind of where different things stand in that hierarchy in a way.
Yeah, that's a great point. On its own, a simultaneous decrease in demand and supply, it's like, oh, no big deal. People don't want as much stuff. We're not producing much stuff. It's all a wash, right? But if people are depending on that for their incomes to participate in the economy as consumers, then you have a problem.
Yeah.
You have restaurant workers who can't get the things they need because they don't have their incomes anymore.
Right, and that's I think a big part of like, at least in some places like Italy, where a lot of the economy is like service sector or tourism and stuff. I think this has also been talked about a lot, that like those people are just not going to get their incomes and that's a huge
Right.
issue. Even though it's not such a big issue objectively that people are not happening to go on vacation like right now. In the big picture, that objective consequence isn't as bad. It's more the consequence on people's money supply that is bad. And then, like you said, the consequence maybe that they can't pay back a loan, and then that affects the financial sector, and then that also has effects. And
But I think, I feel like there's something you're not saying, which is that can also kick off a vicious cycle.
Oh, definitely, yeah.
Those people will then really be pulling back on as much spending as they possibly can, and then the people that provide services to them are suddenly hurting, and it just
absolutely, But you see what I mean? Maybe about how that's different than maybe a consequence of the virus not directly on production. It has more to do with money supply, how money supply is affected by the virus in a way,
right?
Because otherwise it could kick back up. If people, let's say people were volunteering their time to work at restaurants, and all of their money came from basic income, which obviously they wouldn't volunteer their time. But then, if their money were still flowing through, they still would have a constraint on buying goods produced in factories that people couldn't go to. But you wouldn't have this cycle of everybody's money supply is cut now, and so then they don't spend, and so then they don't spend, and do you see what I mean?
Right. They don't have to buy. They don't have the money to buy the stuff. Even the stuff that doesn't
it could be produced. Exactly.
Right. That isn't the production of which isn't affected.
That's kind of what I'm trying to say. Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
Doesn't take it's not a convention center.
Right.
Businesses bringing together thousands of people.
Yeah. So you could imagine that there's going to be shortages of some things and oversupply of other things if people don't have enough money to spend. So my mom says on the live stream, UBI would not help with shortages, and that's exactly right.
Yeah.
But not everything is we're not going to have a shortage of everything, and there are things we don't have a shortage of that people still want and need access to, and that's what UBI helps with. Indirectly, it might help with shortages if we live in a more stable economy where people are more confident and, there aren't people who are poor, whatever, without health insurance. I guess I'm adding other policies in here. But yeah, you could imagine that if we live in a more stable economy, then people might panic less and there'd be less of a cause of shortages. So some of the shortages are due to people just can't work. You can't, either they're sick or we want to quarantine them and keep them out of the workplace, out of the factories. So that's part of the shortages. Another part of the shortages is everyone panics and buys all the stuff. And even if there's plenty of capacity to produce at normal levels, there's still a shordage because everyone's, buying all the toilet paper.
Yeah.
Quilted Northern, Ultra Plush, can't get it anywhere, I'm just saying.
It's so sad.
We had to buy lesser toilet paper. Yeah.
So our lives are so rough. But I think that could also be a little bit worse with the UBI too, because it's wealthier people who can afford to stockpile the toilet paper. So if everybody has just more money and is panicking, that particular issue could be worse. It's kind of hard to say.
Yeah, that's true.
It depends on how big you want to go with the effects of basic income and how long the world has had it and how international it is. Because obviously if we had more international development and wealth, you can weather these kinds of things more because there's more total productive capacity. It's more flexible. The virus is hit over here, but there's still possibility to make more stuff over there.
Yeah.
So that's a bigger picture, how the world could change, be more resilient.
Right. And then there's the question of what does it look like if we already had a basic income in place? And then there's the question of what happens if we do basic income now?
Oh, I see.
Right?
In response. Yeah, because you haven't had the chance to develop everything. Yeah.
Yeah, Nick.
I want to go back about the question about whether UBI would affect shortages. I sort of think. Imagine rice production. It's highly mechanized. Doesn't require bringing together a big crowd of people into close proximity. Let's just say, I don't actually know how rice is produced, but let's just say it's mostly one guy driving a giant tractor and then another guy saying, okay, let it down into the truck.
Yeah.
But if nobody has money to buy the rice, then that guy could go out of business.
Right, and that
Right.
affects capacity too. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a great point.
So even if you have the capacity to begin with, if nobody's buying, then the capacity is no longer activated. Then you lose the capacity.
Like that guy can't pay back his loan, so he can't get another loan to get the seed rice for next year's.
Yeah,
rice.
we saw that kind of stuff happen during the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Exactly that kind of stuff. Yeah, go ahead, Richard.
There was an article on futurism where they had this automated van that sprayed like antibiotic or antivirus stuff in China. So maybe that could happen here.
This actually happened, or this was like a
This
proposal?
is happening.
Huh. What did they spray it on, like the streets and stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I always wondered, it shows pictures of them spraying clouds of something all the time, and I'm always wondering what that is that they're spraying,
Maybe it's
and
like
whether it's something
Lysol.
that actually works or, yeah.
Well, it could just be like Lysol type stuff. Like alcohol does kill this virus. Could be that.
Okay, yeah.
I don't know.
And they sprayed you with something in New Zealand, right?
That was fishy, but it's New Zealand, so it was probably okay. That was, on the airplane, it was very creepy. They like sprayed everyone down on the airplane. We were not warned this was going to happen.
This was pre-coronavirus.
This was a long time
This was a
ago.
while
Yeah, this
ago.
is a long time ago. They're very concerned about because it's an unusual ecosystem on a very particular island, so they're very concerned about outside things getting in. Yeah, and so I think it was probably something like like alcohol, or something that was like safe enough for us, but that would kill organisms that were coming in. They were also very concerned going like Southern Ireland to Northern Ireland, even by car. They give us all these pamphlets on washing our shoes that were muddy, and so anyway, it was more part of that than like an anti-virus or antibacterial thing. It wasn't really that. I don't know that it would have been effective.
Do they wash your car tires if you were driving in mud?
That's a good question. I don't remember like how carefully. There was some kind of checkpoint. I don't know how carefully they were really monitoring.
All right.
Yeah.
So
I really like that point, though, about productive capacity shutting down.
Yeah.
And it also made me think of another point, which is more about, like, if we'd already had basic income for a long time, then anything that can be naturally automated more easily, like, would have been, which obviously is more resilient to something like this, because if people can't go in and produce it, but we've automated it more, then it's easier to keep doing it. If we've automated it less because we want to, like, give people their jobs, then obviously that's obviously less.
If we have less of a culture of creating jobs for everyone, then we're going to be less dependent on human labor.
Right, which is like an interesting feature that I think this highlights for people. Usually people are always thinking like people doing the work is good because that's how people get their money.
Right.
But I think it becomes more like, obviously this is not the main thing I think about with not having people wasting their time doing like useless work. But I guess like a side effect that shows up in a pandemic is that you actually want to rely on like people as little as possible. Which is, there's benefit to that at least. Yeah.
And with things like cherries, there's these, you can put these like umbrellas underneath it, and it shakes the cherry tree, and all the cherries fall down into the thing, and then you can transport the cherries to the factory, and they make maraschino cherries or whatever.
Nice.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys have already talked about like also just the effects of like poverty on spreading the disease too, in terms of like a basic income.
Yeah, I mean, we briefly mentioned that, but yeah, I mean, it makes a huge difference. Both poverty and, a robust healthcare system as well,
Right.
Which are problems that we haven't really quite addressed in this country.
I guess I'm just thinking about like one thing, some of you were there for like the talk we saw with Carl, and we were talking about how like if there's a lot of pressure to go to work, even when you're sick, and you're like a food worker or healthcare or anyone really, like that's pressure against containing something like this. So there's that, and then there's just like, if you don't have like a home to go like self-quarantine in, or then you have to be in the healthcare system, or you might not be caught as early. There's all different kinds of things, but there's a big factor of having just more personal resources to like help protect other people in a way by self-quarantining the apartment or whatever.
Yeah. So I mean, I think you're right that like if we'd already had a basic income, this as well as many other things would be working a lot better. We'd be more robust to this kind of shock to our society and our economy.
Yeah.
We'd probably have to, I think I was mentioning earlier, we'd probably have to get by with less of a basic income for a little while until we got back up to capacity. But we wouldn't necessarily have to have like a crash in the financial sector or something like that.
And I feel like in this kind of case, that would make sense to people. Like they wouldn't necessarily be like outraged about it. Because they would understand like why it has.
It's like being at war. Everybody has to sacrifice something in order for us all to.
Or that Bird Box movie on Netflix, where the whatever is causing people to go insane, and they kill the other people, or
was that a supply shock or a demand shock?
Both. Sounds like a good show.
Interesting.
Yeah. So and then there's the question of can something like this motivate putting some of these systems in place, not just basic income, but especially healthcare, getting a better healthcare system. Like when it's a pandemic, when it's literally like there's a virus that's going around, that gets people, I think, to think about like how do we have a stronger healthcare system? It's not about like every man for himself. Everybody, like we're all in this together, and we all transmit disease and that kind of thing. But then also basic income, right? Like if we put in a disaster income, right, to kind of respond to this. Who's to say that, like once we see that the effects are good for the economy and working, like maybe we don't have to stop. That would be a nice kind of silver lining, right? That would be a good outcome. Just kind of the way after 2008 we had various reforms that were put in place that maybe to dubious effect.
Like financial reforms kind of thing?
Yeah, regulations. Financial regulations, that kind of thing.
But those financial regulations are being undone by Republicans. And
yeah, and it's not clear.
And they're like toothless.
It's not clear how effective, those regulations are in the first place. A lot of times, politicians want to do something visible, and then they can say, hey, we did this thing, and be able to talk about it. And sometimes that's maybe more important than actually kind of addressing the problems.
Or they just think it's going to be effective,
right.
And it isn't. Like you have ideas about that with financial regulations.
Right.
Maybe they don't realize there's like an underlying pressure to find ways to get around the rules, and like if you're not addressing that, it's kind of, I don't know.
Yeah, and there's motivated reasoning, and there's an incentive to believe that the thing you passed is going to make a difference, and all that kind of stuff too.
Well, there's that, but I guess that you have a different view of like what caused the financial crisis than other people. So like if people think of it, the mortgage problem as causing it, they're going to address that understandably,
right?
As opposed to if they think it's like something about interest rates, they're going to try to address that. So it depends on what they view the cause as.
Right. Yes. So my mom says no one seems to be talking about the spread through homeless encampments or border facilities. I think a lot of people are talking about border facilities. Homeless encampments.
It's hard to quarantine yourself when you're homeless.
Right. Yeah.
That's true. And it's also, Bethany and I were talking about this the other day, but at least, maybe not in China, but here, the people who initially got sick were people of higher SES because they're the ones who can travel. Yeah. They're the ones who go to big conferences.
Which is kind of beneficial.
Yeah. So it'll be interesting to see what happens when that's not the way it is anymore, when it starts getting to more
other
different types of people. Yeah. And we see this a little bit in Seattle with the retirement homes and stuff like that. Yeah. They're probably high SES if they're in a retirement home, but they're also more vulnerable.
Because they're in a communal living.
Right, yes.
Yeah. I guess that's why they're closing colleges because of this, right? The communal living situations are also vulnerable.
Yeah, I saw a chart that showed how many lives can be saved if everyone adopts social distancing a day earlier.
Oh,
right.
Wow.
And then I saw that chart and I was like, now I feel guilty about having this discussion group
tonight.
Right. But
it's very hard to know. Like those calculations are very difficult, I think, for governments and for everybody.
But we've seen that China has taken pretty extreme measures and their cases have flattened off. But other countries that have not taken as extreme measures, like South Korea and Japan, and I think even Italy is starting to level off a little bit now. So I think there's optimism to be had. with respect to that. Yeah.
That's a good point. But anyway, to Joan's point and yours, Steve, like that's kind of the extreme end of what I had in mind about like if people are more poor, they can't like they don't have a place to self-quarantine or like all that kind of thing. Another thing I haven't mentioned yet, or maybe someone else mentioned it, is like this particular pandemic, at least, or we don't know about all of them, but like, you know, if you're already having health concerns, it's more dangerous. And obviously, like one thing I read about with homeless people is a lot of them have the kind of health concerns that are kind of comorbid with having a worse outcome. Yeah. So that's another poverty and healthcare related issue is like, what's the baseline health of the population? Yep. And I guess you saw that with like a separate issue of like smoking in China, where there's like high smoking rates, which isn't really just about healthcare, but it's something else.
Is that what explained why more men were dying? Because they were smoking more? I've seen multiple. Yeah. I
think it's one of the causes they talk about. There's also a general lower rate of, in general with flus and things like this, women do better than men. They also have more autoimmune disorders, so those go together. Like they seem to have a stronger immune system.
Oh, right,
you're
mentioning that. Yeah.
So that's also just more of a robust gender difference. I don't know if they know why that gender difference exists, but there's that plus the smoking thing as well. Yeah.
Okay. The season, it's colder, so it kills off the virus faster.
Sometimes the colder season is better for the virus. Depends on the virus. So like with the common flu, it apparently has like a little protective casing around it as it's traveling through the air that's supposed to get broken down by the warmth of the body. And if it's warm outside, then that casing will dissolve and that it won't make it to the next host as well. So that's why the regular flu is more popular in the winter or in the cold. But not everything works like that.
Yeah, I don't think it's known whether coronavirus has that kind of seasonal effect or any kind of seasonal thing. It's looking like it's not the same as the flu.
And it lasts long. SARS, it was just it's the same coronavirus sort of thing.
Right.
It lasts a week on surfaces. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so a lot of different variables in there. You guys ready for the article? Any comments before we get in here?
Kind of forgot we had an article.
Oh, we have an article.
We always have an article. I don't know.
So let's
it's right there.
Pull it up. We'll make it appear for the live stream there. So the coronavirus is going to introduce economic conditions with which few people in modern America are familiar. The prospect of shortages. After 25 years of offshoring and consolidation, we now rely on overseas production for just about everything. Now, in the wake of the coronavirus, China has shut down much of its production. South Korea and Italy will shut down as well. Once the final imports from these countries have worked their way through the supply chains and hit our shores, it could be a while before we get more. This coronavirus will reveal, in other words, a crisis of production. So I just want to point out that this article is from like February 26th or 25th or something like that. Yeah.
I'm not sure this paragraph makes sense.
Yeah, February 25th. Go ahead, Steve.
Well, it's saying that, he's complaining about offshoring and consolidation. And it's complaining that we in America rely on overseas production. And so that's why we're going to suffer shortages. But China relies on Chinese production too.
Right.
And so China is also is suffering shortages. So his reasoning to complain about offshoring doesn't make sense to me here.
Yeah, I had the same problem actually. Also, like by now, maybe not at this point, but by now the U.S. is also showing cases. Like it's not clear that if we had domestic production, we wouldn't run into trouble the same way because we'd have the same issues with producing it.
I think there is an issue where when something like this happens, countries close in on themselves. So to the extent that everybody is kind of depending on international trade, a lot of that might break down because everyone wants to kind of take care of themselves first, that kind of thing.
There can be some of that. But I think the solution would not be to have totally like redundant production in each country. Well, I guess that would like make you somewhat more resilient just because you'd have so much redundancy, but at
Yeah.
a huge cost.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the question is, what's the balance,
Right.
or where do you want to make the trade-offs? What amount of redundancy is prudent to have? You know, like
Yeah.
we've talked in here about kind of keeping domestic capacity warm and active and ready to
Right.
go, just in case, you know, that kind of thing.
Sort of like the Army Corps of engineers, or
Yeah.
like you have the domestic capacity in case you need it, in case China shuts off or whatever.
Yeah, and you see this with like you know, Venezuela was dependent on imports, and the only thing they produced was oil. Then it became no longer a viable product, and you know,
Yeah.
So there's a certain
Right.
amount of kind of redundancy and resiliency that you do want.
Right.
The question is how much.
Yeah.
Well, if we depended for imports on New Zealand, them hosing everything down with Lysol all the time, I don't think they've had any coronavirus cases, and
They
they'd
have.
be in better shape than if we depended
They
on
have
America.
now, but they didn't for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's tricky, and I'm not sure it's about domestic versus foreign. I guess if people like stop wanting to trade with each other, but I think it's also just about international redundancy
Right.
versus efficiency.
Yeah. And I think, you know, I think he goes a little too far saying like, oh, after 25 years of offshoring and consolidation, you know, generally speaking, that stuff makes everything more efficient.
Right.
It's good.
Yeah.
But you could add in there that, you know, as we do these things, we might want to have some redundancy as well. So it's not like all one thing or the other, you know. And then the idea that immediately what he's starting with is shortages, and it's both, as we kind of were saying earlier, it's both, right? There's reduced demand for a lot of stuff, and there's reduced supply for some things, and there's increased demand for other things. So it's not just shortages.
Yeah.
It's not like
It's more complicated.
I'm trying to think of something it's not like. An example of, I mean, it's not like the 1970s where there was like an oil shock or something like that. Like there's more things going on because
Saudi Arabia is actually producing more oil and it's lower than $30.
Yeah, so that's the other thing that's happening right now is oil prices have crashed, completely unrelated to coronavirus, or probably unrelated to coronavirus. The oil-producing nations failed to come to an agreement because they usually like to collude and keep the prices higher, which is what actually gives us our oil prices. That broke down, so now they're just producing a lot more oil. So that's happening at the same time, and it's also affecting markets.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So I guess a question we can ask is how much shutting down of capacity is there going to be?
Hard to say.
And, you know, early on, you know, we're kind of early on in this thing right now, and we're seeing, you know, changes in demand and changes in supply and various things, but we haven't gotten close to the potential for kind of shutting down productive capacity that we could potentially get to. Yeah.
China is already starting to ramp back up, I think. Now.
Yeah. So maybe, you know,
So it's
it
kind of hard
might
to
this might be
predict.
about as bad as it gets.
I'm not saying that, but it's kind
Well,
of hard to predict if
right,
it's going to
yeah.
be like going in waves through different countries, or if it's going to like hit
Right.
everywhere at a time, or
Yeah, if China is able to ramp back up while at the same time keeping the coronavirus under control, that's a good sign. What's something that's a little bit concerning is the idea that a country kind of gets it under control, but then other people don't. So
And
then
they,
they
like,
ease up,
reinfect.
and then it comes back, and you know,
Yeah.
like that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. What I read suggested they were being quite cautious. They weren't just like, oh, we're ramping back up. But I have no idea. It wasn't a very detailed article, so I'm not sure. And they might also be cautious about like visitors incoming as well.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about that either.
Okay. Next one. We've been through something like this once before. My book, Goliath, describes the 1932 campaign for president, one that was carried out at the depths of the Great Depression and during an era when our productive capacity was shut down. Though the crisis at that time was caused by a banking collapse, not a pandemic, the political backdrop was analogous. 88 years ago, Old order politicians, as they were known, proved unwilling, even in the face of crisis, to have government apply its power toward the broader public benefit. Their recalcitrance prefigured in certain ways the reflexively libertarian thinking of today. So I have some issues with this. The Great Depression, people didn't have money, and that's what caused the capacity not to be activated and ultimately caused the capacity to shrink.
Yeah.
Kind of like what we were saying before with Nick. But this is kind of the opposite of that. This is, at least to some extent, the capacity is shrinking because people aren't able to work, and supply chains are being interrupted, and then that's caused. So it's a more, with the Great Depression, the ultimate cause wasn't a loss of capacity. A loss of capacity resulted. Here, it seems like the loss of capacity is more the cause because we're not able to produce.
Totally.
Yeah.
Although I guess, go ahead, Nick. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say that, maybe, I mean, I think the scary prospect is that the epidemic and people's responses to it is an initial shock that triggers a worse,
like a feedback loop.
A feedback loop that gets us into makes things worse and worse. And I think in that sense there's a potential parallel. In the Great Depression, the initial shock that started off the feedback loop was a banking collapse, and in this case it's something different. But maybe the important dynamic has to do with that feedback loop, not what sort of pushes the thing off.
Yeah, and you could have a similar feedback loop because what's happening now with coronavirus, that can trigger a financial sector collapse as well.
Yeah.
And then you could have a similar type of thing. It occurs to me, though, that initially, the Great Depression was kind of a deflationary feedback loop. Whereas here, at least what's going on now, is you'd think it'd be more, you're talking about shortages, that's more inflationary pressure. There's not enough stuff, so it drives up the prices, that kind of thing. So that's one way in which it's different. But it could tip over in the other direction if the financial sector collapse, causes, people's spending capacity to drop below, to drop faster than kind of the production capacity of the economy or something like that. So there's like a lot of things at play.
Yeah.
Basic income could prevent that part of it, could prevent the kind of deflationary spiral, and people just not having enough money, that kind of thing. Not going to prevent the shortages, at least not directly. But if you had a low enough basic income and you admitted that, people can be poorer, then you could have maybe something a little smoother where there's just less stuff, everybody's poorer, they can buy less stuff, but they're not like completely at zero. Right now, a lot of people could be thrown completely at zero because they're dependent on the jobs, that kind of thing. They're dependent on being able to borrow and all of that. Right.
So like specific, it could be like specific items or specific industries, and sort of how do you manage that in terms of economic policy?
Yeah, so I think there's the shortages we see now, which are largely a result of, just a sudden demand shock. People want all these things that are related to...
And I'm not quite talking about that, because I think that's relatively minor. Right. But I guess I'm thinking like, well, I don't know what I'm thinking. I'm thinking it could be like shortages of people to do certain kinds of work, or shortages of products, but not shortages of services, or shortages, I don't know, like it could be weird.
So like which supply chains are going to be interrupted?
Yeah, it's
that
like
kind
not
of thing.
totally obvious, depending on if it spreads, I don't know, everywhere and at what time, and I don't know.
It's an interesting question. Yeah.
I don't know how, I guess basic income you wouldn't do anything differently. It would kind of just average across the things that are still easy to buy and not, kind of.
Yeah, basically you'd get this averaging across, and you'd also interrupt any kind of like deflationary feedback loop. Mm-hmm. You'd also potentially interrupt an inflationary feedback loop if, because you could have a small basic income, and then you could say, and then the Federal Reserve wouldn't feel like they had to, overstimulate the financial sector anymore or something like that. Because they're not worried that, there are just people who don't have anything, or that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of the key things about fiscal stimulus, just distributing money to everyone, is that you don't have to overdo things in order to get a little bit to go to the poorer people. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. Anyone have any more thoughts on this? It's interesting, reflexively libertarian thinking of today.
I feel like this guy has some opinions.
He has some opinions, yeah.
He just means like anti-stimulus spending or something.
Yes, anti-stimulus spending, anti-doing things, I guess in general for the collective benefit of society, which he's kind of lumping the stimulus in. Yeah, he's kind of categorizing it as that.
Or maybe like resistance to universal health care. I don't know what he really has in mind there. Maybe he explains
Well, here he's talking about kind of the Great Depression and how they let the financial sector fail. They
I guess
let the
maybe
banks fail.
like the way that
Yeah.
now we would like bail out the banks after 2008, that would have been something that they wouldn't have wanted to do back then. Is that kind of like...
Yeah, there was a lot of pushback against that kind of thing.
Right.
And there is today, a lot of
Right.
people say we shouldn't have bailed out the banks in 1932.
But I guess like the fact that your
Yeah.
general bank is insured by the government has become kind of commonplace. So there's
Right.
some things that...
And that was
should
something,
be
he mentions that was something they pushed against back then. And that was a product of the Great Depression as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where we go. What kinds of new policies and structures will we develop? Institutions will we develop as a consequence of this? What weaknesses will we identify and try to fix?
I feel like a few of the things are going to just be like very practical and very simple, but very useful. And by that I mean just like guidelines, like standardized guidelines of like, when do you shut down the schools? When do you do this?
Yeah.
When do you do, like, no one really knows that, it seems like, and it's different in different countries, and like nobody has a sort of expectation about how it's going to go, which I think is just maybe like lack of experience with exactly this kind of thing.
Yeah.
But to me, that would be like super useful, and I suspect something like that will come out of this from scholars or whatever. Yeah.
Did you guys read somewhere? I can't remember where. I was reading a description of the response in Taiwan. Apparently, they've been really successful, even though they're super close to China. And they had a plan with like 127 action items that they were gonna put in place.
Yeah.
Really?
And they did it. It was like on day one, like on January 1st or something. They heard about this thing, and they were like, "Okay, we're gonna start screening every person before they got off the plane."
Right. Wow.
And,
Wow.
It's been successful.
That's very different than the stories you hear here, where people have coronavirus and then they're like, no, you don't meet the criteria to get tested. And but I mean, part of that is due to not having the capacity to test everyone,
Right.
and having to like ration who gets to get the test and that kind of thing.
Actually, in China, they have this like scanner thing, or like infrared that tests people's temperature and whatnot.
Right. Yeah, that should be a pretty straightforward thing to do. You don't have to be able to. You don't have to be able to test for a specific virus to know that someone has a fever.
Right.
I think that's what they put in place right away was, but we're going to screen people using temperature and other symptoms.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Pretty smart. We probably should have done that. Yeah.
But I mean, I can imagine, like people in epidemiology or health policy classes in the future will like study all these different countries and how they responded differently, and you have all this data on what worked and what didn't.
And Taiwan put it in place after the last time this happened with SARS.
Yeah, exactly. So they had that experience. But
Makes
now
sense.
that it's hit so many places, or at least now that it's hit the U.S. more, I suspect the U.S. Academy will have recommendations for the future that are more standardized.
Yeah, it would be interesting if we had like an international institution.
We could call it
the World Health Organization.
Well, and maybe I don't actually know. I'm kind of naive. I mean, I've been reading this and that, but I don't know if like the World Health Organization had like very standard, like very good recommendations and people just haven't been following them, or if it's actually like they didn't have something like that confident to put out for every country to just like, this is what we recommend.
Yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting question because they did keep putting out recommendations, and a lot of those recommendations I think were not listened to by the various different countries. They didn't declare a pandemic until today.
Yeah, I saw that.
Yeah.
But I wonder if like if the recommendations are perceived as like ad hoc, even if they're coming from the World Health Organization, they might be less persuasive than if they're perceived as like kind of like these standard recommendations that came out of a past epidemic that people have like thought about and.
Well,
I'm sure.
I think the fact that we don't know means that they are not perceived in the way that you would like.
Yeah, but I don't know if that's our fault or their. I don't know if they like actually had them for a long time. They've had them since SARS, and like people just don't listen to them, or
Yeah.
For me, this brings up something which I think is connected to one of the themes that you've been talking about, Alex, which is that from some of the reporting, it sounds like the administration was worried. They were like, well, yeah, we could start screening every person when they get off the plane, but we're worried about triggering a collapse in the financial markets.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a really good point.
And so, and I think, that's a very extreme version of it. But like, even if that weren't the case, you might still be, in the early period where it's uncertain, is this really going to turn into a big deal?
Right.
You might worry about the economic costs
Totally.
of, shutting things down
and that's
and the other
reasonable
costs,
as well.
like people's education's being disrupted and people's
It is reasonable.
vacation plans.
But if we had basic income and we weren't depending on this brittle financial system, then I think that's the point you're making, that maybe we wouldn't be so worried about that.
At least that part of it. Yeah.
We could
There's still
respond
other
more
parts,
directly to the...
Right. We could pay attention to the actual things to worry about, and not this sort of artificial thing that is coupled to our politics, right?
Yeah.
That's like another layer of it, which is
Right. That's a great point. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah.
Anyone have any more comments about this one? Okay. The old order had no answers. Congress held hearings, but businessmen, academics, and bankers proffered only belt tightening.
This is the Great Depression.
This is the Great Depression.
and hog slaughtering.
And hog slaughtering. Within the Republican establishment, President Herbert Hoover worked 18-hour days, extorting confidence while refusing to take even basic steps such as having the government guarantee bank deposits. Instead, his administration's army attacked hungry protesters in Washington, D.C., a move that prompted an angry Republican congressman, Fiorello LaGuardia of New York, to remind the president, soup is cheaper than tear gas bombs. That's a true story.
Good quote.
Yes.
Yeah.
Reminds me of when I like to say that basic income is cheaper than not having a basic income.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It also, this is kind of random, but apparently there were students partying after like a school, one of the colleges was closed. It wasn't Harvard, and the campus police shot them with maybe tear gas, maybe not, but with paint guns. Did you guys know campus police had paint guns?
Like paintball guns?
Yeah, like paintball guns.
Okay.
So that happened. So it's much milder than this, but that was kind of crazy.
Huh.
Just to get them to disperse, I think, because they're obviously closing for a reason. They don't want them to all like congregate and then go home.
They were partying, or they were...
I think it was partying that was in
protesting.
the street. No, they weren't protesting or partying, but it was in the street. It wasn't that they were shutting down a protest. It was that they were shutting down the fact that all the students were getting together, I think, and potentially transmitting the disease right before they go home, which is a big concern with these like quarantines and stuff, is that then that ends up spreading it even more or something. So they don't want students like congregating all of a sudden, which of course they are doing because they're last chance to see their friends. And so I think it was more around that. They weren't protesting, I don't think.
I've
If they
heard a
were
story.
becoming invisible,
Yeah.
then you'd really have to take some action to keep them visible.
That's right. Right, train them. Anyway, I just heard this from students today, so maybe it's an urban legend. I don't really know.
Huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be curious to know more about that. Campus police with paintball guns.
I
That's a
just
new one
didn't
on
know
me.
that was even
Yeah.
an option
Yeah.
that I was going to encounter.
Yeah.
But anyway, sorry, that's a bit of a side
They
point.
could also use like rubber bullets.
Yeah, maybe they thought the paintball guns were like less painful than that. I'm not really sure. I've never been shot with a paintball thing. It would ruin your clothes.
Yep. It would. You don't want to get it in your eyes. So yeah.
They could put out your eyes.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about the Great Depression is that there wasn't really anything outside of the financial stuff.
Yeah.
Right. Like
That's
it eventually just got so brittle. I mean, there was like the real estate market in Florida, and Benjamin Strong, the president of the New York Fed. I guess they were governors back then. The governor of the New York Fed died, and then monetary policy changed, and that was kind of a big part of what precipitated the Great Depression. Yeah. So this is the Great Depression is almost even a cleaner example because it's entirely due to problems in financial markets.
Right. I was going to say
spilling over into
it's an easier problem
stuff.
to solve. Like if at the beginning they had just pumped money into the situation, it would have been fine.
Yes. So and then here where we are today, we need to pump money into the situation, but we've still got a global pandemic.
Yeah, there's
right?
Other issues.
Yeah.
But that's fascinating because like the Great Depression was so bad.
It was,
even though it was just caused by that lack of money issue, kind of, or like the financial collapse. It was still had so many consequences for so many people that lasted so long, including potential socio-political consequences if you believe those stories, and all sorts of things. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyone have any more comments on this one?
Okay, I was trying to confirm because I heard this rumor that I'm reading here that police used pepper balls containing an irritant against Ohio State and University of Cincinnati students who were protesting the cancellation of in-person classes.
Oh, that's a different story than I heard. I thought mine was a Boston example too, maybe BC or VU. I don't know. So maybe there's both.
Both of that.
I should look that up.
I'm concerned that something like a pepper ball might irritate you and make you more susceptible to like getting the virus or something like that. Yeah.
Pepper ball. Why would they?
How many different kind of ball shooting guns are in the back of those police
It
cars?
makes everybody sneeze, and then they have to...
Yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah, that doesn't seem good. Wow.
If neo-Nazis were gathering, then you shot them with rainbow-colored paintballs.
Yes, there you
and
go.
And then made them all rainbow-colored.
Then they'd all start attacking each other.
Yeah. Or run away. Yeah, that's good. Right, you gotta fit it to the.
Yeah.
That's funny.
Okay, here we go. That era's political desperation is alien to us for a few reasons. First off, we haven't faced shortages of such magnitude for a very long time. More importantly, we have for decades lived under a political framework known as affluence, a term popularized by economist John Kenneth Galbraith in the 1950s. As an affluent society, America automatically produces a surfeit of jobs and wealth, and the problem is solely one of distributing the bounty.
Really? Like, I feel like the surfeit of jobs part is not how the politicians talk about it. They're always worried about creating more jobs.
Yes. But I think that's kind of how John Kenneth Galbraith talked about it.
I see.
Right? He wrote this book in the 1950s, which was kind of like post-war golden age for white people,
Okay. Yeah.
Cool. But yeah.
He proposed a universal basic income as well.
Did he?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think I actually have heard that. I haven't actually read what he said on it. But yeah, one, of course, it's interesting to kind of lump jobs, like more jobs is a good thing automatically. Yeah. Like this is a thing we need to produce for people, jobs.
That is kind of funny.
Yeah.
Producing jobs for people.
Yeah.
Here's a task you can go do. We made it up for you.
But then there's this idea that we do have the capacity to kind of make everyone wealthy, and it's only a problem of distribution, right? And I think that's generally how we think even in here, right? That like we have the capacity to end poverty, nobody needs to be hungry, nobody needs to be homeless. We have the resources to make all these things happen. And there's something going on in the way we're distributing resources that it makes it so some people are homeless and some people are starving and that kind of thing. So I think that's true, that we do think about it that way, especially in here. But just because we take a hit to our economy or coronavirus happens, doesn't mean that the distribution problems go away.
Yeah, in some ways they could be more important.
In some ways they can be more important because we don't have as much extra stuff.
Right.
Yeah. So I still think the problems that need to be solved, that we need to solve in terms of like distributing resources, allocating resources optimally for people, that kind of thing, it's very much important. If not more important, in a world where we're really constrained on that dimension. Yeah.
I mean, if part of the problem is people like not being motivated to work, we've talked about how like the basic income can be lower for that reason or something like that, or there's isn't as much stuff for people to buy either way. But this is a different kind of issue where it's about capacity. Like people can't safely go
Right.
to work.
Yeah.
I guess I'm struggling to think about like how would you change things. Obviously, you might do more to like invest in production capacity if you can, if you're constrained in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's an interesting question because he's basically taking the stance of, oh, everyone's gone soft. We've all been spoiled by, like having an abundance of imported goods and, all of that type of stuff. And now we need to face reality and get back to, I think the overall point that he's trying to make is that we need to all think of ourselves as producers again, and we need to focus on producers and production and that kind of stuff.
But like we've talked about, trade makes production more efficient. You produce more with international trade than you do without it.
You do. That's true.
Kind of a strange way of looking at it.
But you can look at it as, because we rely on international trade for production, we are not producers ourselves. And that's why he says, like, we're rentiers, living off the work of foreign country workers and stuff like that. So we've gotten kind of complacent and just kind of like letting other people do the work for us. So yeah, trade makes production more efficient, but it also means people don't have to actually contribute as much, right?
But also, if we had no trade and we were the ones that were having the virus more, like kind of to Steve's point, then we'd be more screwed than if we did have trade. Like, if we could still buy stuff but couldn't produce it.
Yes.
Then, I mean, it kind of depends on where the virus is concentrated.
Well, I don't think he's advocating, cutting off trade. I think he's saying that everybody needs to be prepared in their own corner of the world or something like that.
Just like have some backup capacity or something? Just like more redundancy, something like that.
Yeah, like, Google Maps goes down and nobody knows how to read a map or something like that. He wants more people to know how to read the map of production.
Or
Yeah.
the oil reserves in like New Orleans or whatever.
Yeah.
Why does he call affluence a political framework?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, so he talks a lot in here about politicians assuming that we have access to all this stuff and it's a matter of kind of distributing it or something like that. And then that's politically that's what politicians are fighting over. Like, how do we manage this bounty of wealth that is available to our country and
But isn't it true that we have access to that stuff? Like, isn't this your point, Nick? Like,
maybe not.
In
It
general?
was maybe yesterday, but not today.
Okay, but then the point should be like,
Yeah.
it's obviously like occasional things can happen where we don't, or like now maybe we don't, or something like that.
Right.
But we generally have. That's why people. It doesn't seem just like a political framework to me.
No, it's much more than a political thing.
Yeah.
He's kind of focusing on the politics here.
Yeah.
Um,
But I mean, I think in
yeah.
this particular case, it sounds like the politics come out of what's at least short-term efficient. And
Yeah.
then there's this question of like long-term risk aversion and how to.
Well, let me get to the next quote, which is relevant to this. Under the siren song of affluence, we began offshoring critical production capacity in the 1960s for geopolitical reasons. In 1971, economist Nicholas Kaldor noted that American financial policies were turning a nation of creative producers into a community of rentiers, increasingly living on others, seeking gratification in ever more useless consumption, with all the debilitating effects of the bread and circuses of imperial Rome. Still, Bill Clinton and George Bush accelerated this trend throughout the 1990s
Hey, this
and
guy
2000s.
is the guy who's political.
This guy is the guy
he
who's
clearly
political.
feels strongly about this on like a moral level.
He does, yes,
rather
I
than
agree.
Just like a practical level. I'm getting that vibe from him. I could be wrong.
Yeah, I mean, where are you getting that from?
But like he's kind of mixing the practical with the moral. It kind of feels like to me.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, as opposed to just being like, oh, like one downside of this is you don't have as much redundancy. Then when the shock happens, you don't have as much redundancy. Of course, there's upside. It's more efficient. He's not like thinking about it the way I would.
Right. He's basically like, everybody got complacent and spoiled, and now we have to pay the price now that we face a real challenge or something
but I mean,
like
how
that.
would he feel about it if if instead of other people were doing it, if we had just like automated more of it? I guess that would be good for coronavirus, but something could come along that like messes with the computer stuff or like the supply chain for the robots, and then he would say like, oh, we got complacent, da da da. But under coronavirus conditions, that would be really good to actually have automated everything.
Yes.
So, you know, I feel like he has this moral idea that you should be doing the work yourself, is sort of my point. It's somewhat disconnected from the effects of, like...
Yeah.
You know, my grandmother lived on a farm, and so she, like, canned everything. And it was during the Depression. And so during, like, the winter or whatever, they had all this food that they canned. And so they were able to live through the winter.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that is in reference to being prepared for more difficult times, that kind of thing?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, I like the point you're making, Bethany, which trade, et cetera, would also lead us to develop, you know, the technologies that would help us be more robust to something like this.
Yeah.
So it's not just, it can't just be, oh, we need to make people work more and more used to working, and, you know, it also, you know, like, it's more complicated than that.
Yeah.
I think he's oversimplifying a lot of these things.
Like a farmer's market sort of thing? You could go to a farmer's market and get your vegetables or whatever.
But it's interesting because, like, in this case of coronavirus, and it would be different for a different issue, but, like, here you actually, like you were saying, you want, like, one farmer making all the food. You don't want, like, a bunch of small farms.
You don't, yeah, exactly. You don't want small farms all trading
that
with each other.
That capacity is going to be hit a lot more easily. You want as much automation as possible. And again, like, that might not be true for another hit to production, but in the case of a disease hit, you want as much automation as possible, which is kind of the opposite of what he seems to be going for.
Right. Yep.
I mean, I don't know. I guess the point I was making was more about, I mean, you could have a bunch of small farmers each working by themselves.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then gathering all the food in one place.
But I guess I'm thinking, like, now you
well, just that they're not working as a team, so they can each, you know, grow their own potatoes or whatever. And
then you choose your melon with an app, and they leave it on your doorstep. And like you never shake their hand.
But I guess if you imagine for the same, like, 1,000 melons, if you only need one person to do it, and you could cycle that person as a different person if the person doing it got a virus or something, then you're less than if you need like 200, 300 people to do that production. You know, like, then you have them need 200, 300 people to be healthy.
I think so. But although if the 200, 300 people also could draw on a reservoir of thousands.
Yeah, but if you scale that to the whole economy. I guess my point is, like, the less labor you need under coronavirus, the better to produce stuff, because labor is getting taken out of the equation.
I guess. I mean, maybe it would be helpful to sort of, you know, specify the scenario we're talking about. I mean, I think that still for maybe 90% of the people, even who get the infection, it's as bad as, like, you know, they lose a week of ability to work.
Yeah, so maybe there isn't that much of a hit from that. But I guess I'm just saying, like, if there is a hit from people getting sick and not being able to work, or needing to care for people who are sick, or like other kinds of things.
With the coronavirus, you could get secondary infections or whatever. And this one person I read, they had it 3 weeks in a row.
But I mean, I think
coronavirus 3 weeks in a row?
If you look at what's going on in Italy, by far the bigger impact. I mean, yeah, a lot of people in Italy have coronavirus, but it's in the, I mean, whatever, maybe it's hundreds of thousands. It's still like a tiny fraction of the population. But still, the precautions that are being taken, that's what's shutting down the economy.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So if you have an economy where everyone gets to work alone anyway, then the precautions aren't going to affect that very much. Is that kind of the point you're making?
Or products that are made by people
that work alone.
Whose the practice of their work doesn't involve anything that is going to have to be stopped because of the precautions.
Right.
I guess I was generally thinking automation helps with, like, if at least maybe now if I imagine like a factory, obviously, like, it used to be you'd have to have a ton of people in there to make it work. Now you might be able, if it's all automated, you just need like one person in there.
Although maybe it's like super automated, and that means the work of, you know, what would have taken 10,000 people 20 years ago is now done by 50. But if you've decided we can't have gatherings of more than 5, that factory has to shut down too.
Yeah, but it's still better than needing a factory full of 1,000 people.
I mean, if the precautions mean it has to shut down either way, it's
I mean,
not
if
any
it's
different.
binary, but it's usually not.
So I think there's two dimensions
how
here.
important it is, you could like screen the people going in. It's more doable the smaller the number.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
come together.
Yeah, so I mean, I think generally speaking, automation is good, makes things more efficient, you don't have to use as much labor, and then there's kind of this dimension of, can the work be done without people exposing themselves to potential risk?
Is the work compatible with
Right.
the precautions
Which is
that are
another thing.
necessary?
Yeah, like if you can do your own home.
And there's some overlap there, of course. Like maybe you couldn't have all that rice being produced where it just gets collected and then dumped into the truck, and one person is like, oh, okay, that's enough rice or something like that. You couldn't have that without some amount of automation.
Oh, they can wear those quarantine suits.
So that's one thing you can do. If there's jobs where people have to work together, you can put them all in suits.
The fewer number of those people, the better, right?
Yeah, the fewer number of them, the better, generally speaking, yeah.
If the world was able to work together, you could argue for the opposite of redundancy. Well, I'm just kind of trying something on in my head. Because like you could imagine if all the manufacturing were in one country, unless it happened to start in that country like it did in China, everyone could, if the world were like highly cooperative, everyone could just be like, okay, we're like heavily screening everybody who comes into this country. I guess I'm pointing out there's like a weird way in which centralization could help you like try to cordon off the most important production sites and protect the world's productivity rather than the other way around. He's assuming redundancy is better, but I'm trying to think through a possible scenario where it would be the opposite.
Right, so you could imagine kind of a feudal society where, everyone's kind of growing their own food and, giving, maybe there's local markets and you're giving some to your, nobles or something like that. And, that's a system with a ton of redundancy, but also a ton of, vulnerability to a pandemic.
Yeah, you're right. Like, I mean, even if every town produces everything it needs, if that town is just a microcosm of the situation we have in the world, you have to stop your production to take proper precautions. You're also screwed.
Right. In that sense, you want it like less less redundant, because you want to be able to like, if there's a problem here, maybe get my stuff from somewhere else. As long as it's not hitting everywhere at once.
Yeah, so you need enough redundancy that if one centralized node gets hit, another one can kind of come in and fill in its place. Or the other nodes can all ramp up a little bit, but you wouldn't want everything to be perfectly distributed, and you wouldn't want a single point of failure either. So there's kind of like a balance to be had.
It's only as strong as only as weak as the weakest chain in the system, or something like that.
I think that's true if you don't have redundancy. Then the weakest link in the system will cause the whole thing to come down. But if you do have some amount of redundancy, then you can replace a broken link with a new link.
It's kind of like not obvious to me we aren't already at a decent point of this, like which would still see effects of something like the coronavirus, but like we already have like somewhat of a number of nodes for a given thing. Probably, maybe I don't understand how the world economy works. Maybe it's not like that.
I think that's true. I think there are a lot of things we could be doing that would make us better prepared for this.
Oh yeah, I just meant in terms of like, is it that we don't have enough like redundancy of factories of certain items? I don't know if that's the key issue for coronavirus.
Yeah, I don't think that's the issue, and this is kind of the issue that he's bringing up here, because we're dependent on on imports. If there are fewer imports from China and Italy, that doesn't mean we can't necessarily import from other places.
I feel like we're not in the worst position. We have a lot of food production and stuff within the United States. A lot of other countries are even more reliant on imports, right?
Yeah, and I mean most of our food production goes into other food production. Like most of our agriculture most of our crops are food for animals that we want to eat. That kind of thing.
That's true.
So there's certainly.
But there's animals are getting infected with the coronavirus.
Sure. The point that I'm making is that there's lots of resources that could be allocated to provide more food than we're currently producing, because we produce food very inefficiently right now to be able to get like our meat and all that stuff. Yeah.
That's a good point. I guess I'm just pointing out it's not clear we're like the most vulnerable country when it comes to his point, but
No, yeah.
always do more.
He seems to be thinking that we're going to hit some kind of reckoning and have to like correct our ways or that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Basic income would be great.
It would be. Let's just. I think everyone's going to assume that would be the main thing. But sadly, I don't think they're.
Yeah.
But that would be fun.
It'll be interesting.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see how it affects the elections this year as well.
Yeah. I feel like a big thing that could I mean, people are already talking so much about healthcare, at least on the Democratic side of things.
Yeah.
So, you could imagine that this would amplify that.
Yeah.
That discussion.
Even if we're kind of past it by then, it's still going to be a big topic, I think, for a while.
People will remember. I mean, because
Yeah.
we'll remember this for at least a few months.
At least a few months, yeah.
Everything's getting like shut down.
Yeah.
Yang actually wanted a Bitcoin system for the elections.
A Bitcoin system. Yeah, I don't think that's going to be helpful.
You mean like the democracy
Blockchain
dollars, or-
voting?
No, blockchain, yes, it's
Oh,
blockchain.
for voting.
Yes.
I don't think that's going to be
You don't think that's
useful.
gonna happen?
No. It's not going to happen, and it's not going to work if it did happen. Yeah.
Were there some quotes on the live
Yeah, so we got some comments on the live stream. So a few back. Jay Gannon says, basic income helps quarantine culture and gives people the liquidity to rebuild local
Yeah,
economies.
that's a good point.
So I think that's right. I mean, even if the basic income is tiny, once you're kind of coming out of it, if you know that everybody around you has money to spend, that's the beginnings of something.
Yeah, and you have a
yeah.
smooth way to like ramp up the income as you have more productive capacity.
Yes.
Whereas now we kind of like get into these crashes and spirals, the way Nick was saying, and then like
Yes.
how do you get back out of it? Maybe.
Yep. And he says, it becomes an old versus new paradigm. Bailouts of pensions and assets, or a mark-to-market valuation and a basic income that distributes the inevitable impending bailouts equally to all.
That's a good point.
So yeah, I guess I don't tend to think of it as there's a certain amount of money that we can use to bail out the system, and then we get to decide, well, the banks.
Economic policy would you think would be needed, if anything, in this kind of situation? Would you still have to do some targeted stuff?
My guess is you might want to target the production of things that are needed specifically to fight the epidemic. So put resources into, staffing up hospitals. China built 11 or something temporary hospitals for coronavirus. They're all shut down now because they've actually managed to make it through. But yeah, that kind of thing. So allocating resources away from where they are towards what's going to help address the pandemic. So that could entail lowering the amount of the basic income, right? And you might have to lower the amount of the basic income anyway because people are, staying home from work, that kind of thing. But in terms of measures, in terms of like bailing anyone out or that kind of thing, you're not going to have the financial sector instability. You're going to have just kind of a general reduction in economic activity that doesn't have to have a feedback loop, that doesn't have to spiral into anything.
I guess I was thinking there are certain things that might make sense. Like if people have a temporary cash flow problem and then they can't pay their mortgage, you wouldn't necessarily want them to like lose their property for their business if it's only like a short-term thing. There are some things like that are being done in Italy, like suspension on mortgage payments and stuff like that. That kind of makes sense to me.
Yeah. If we're imagining a world with basic income, mortgage payments might not be such a big deal at that point anyway.
It might not be, but I mean, it kind of seems like the kind of thing where like you wouldn't want a short-term drop in your income to like affect your like long-term ability to hold on to like a property that you've invested in for a really long time. I mean, it's hard to think about because if we're imagining the basic income world, then resources are being allocated kind of optimally, and then if there's a hit, it's not a matter of you put money into one thing to keep that thing going. It's also a matter of where are you not putting resources? Like where are you taking the resources from? So it's kind of, there's always going to be, like right now we don't really live in a zero-sum world. We could give people money and that would stimulate the economy and everyone would be better off, right? But if we're living in a world where we're already giving everyone the max, right,
then you have to start making these resource trade-offs.
Yeah. I guess this is something you've also brought up in terms of like keeping the basic income maybe like slightly lower than the max, partly for like shocks like this to be more smooth.
Yeah, that's mostly to make room for monetary policy to adjust to volatility and stuff like that. I wouldn't want to live in a world where we're constantly afraid of a global pandemic, and because of that, we are holding ourselves back from our potential, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I think the fact that we are able to mobilize resources right now, or even in the case of a war like World War II, the fact that we're able to mobilize all those resources, it's great that we're able to do that, but it's also a sign that we weren't getting the most out of the economy before then. Yeah. So I would prefer to live in a world where we are getting the most out of the economy. Then a war comes along, we scale back our personal consumption. Pandemic comes along, we scale back. Hi, Derek. A moral imperative to produce for ourselves is not helpful, but there are benefits to decentralized. But are there benefits to decentralized production worth considering? Yeah, and I think mostly that's just you want some level of redundancy.
For less fragility. Kind of.
Right, less fragility. You don't want to go so far that you've got more redundancy than you could ever need, and you're wasting resources. Yeah. He says we can use automation to make more efficient factories, but we can also use automation tech to make it easier for individuals and associations to produce things on their own if they want to. Yep, I think that's right. That's kind of what you were getting at, Bethany. Yeah. So more people are not totally reliant on global supply chains. Yeah.
That's true.
I mean, I think global supply chains are fantastic, and we get the most out of them for efficiency purposes, but we want to have backup systems in place. Yeah. Production for one's own consumption is rare today, but I wonder if that's a consequence of a wages-only income system. You can imagine a world in which people get their basic income and then the stuff they produce for themselves, but they're still using that basic income to buy production from other producers in the economy. So I don't think we'd ever really be able to get back to a world of, I don't think we'd ever be able to get back to a world of everyone produces all of their own stuff. Nor do I think we'd want to do that.
It would take up too many resources per person and things like that.
Yeah. We've managed to vastly increase the carrying capacity of our planet by specializing and trading with each other and having that more centralized efficiency gain.
I think this is something that's really hard to have a good intuition for, because it feels so like green and good to like do your own gardening and stuff, but at scale, like it's just actually way less efficient and good for the environment, and not really feasible, probably easily feasible with the number of people that we have.
Right. Do you want to get to the next quote?
Yeah. Not that people shouldn't do some gardening, but I mean, if we're really trying to like replace the food supply with entirely
right. But I think Derek is right that you could imagine people getting their basic income and not really participating in the greater economy beyond just consuming the certain things that they need and kind of like building the lives for themselves that they want and the kind of communities they want and that kind of thing.
And I think Derek was also bringing up technology. Like there can be like interesting technologies that are developed for like how to grow cool things in your, like more efficiently in your house, or I don't know. Like there are technologies that make some of this more efficient.
Right. So here's the next one. Affluence politics is not the politics of being wealthy, though, but rather the politics of not paying attention to what creates wealth in the first place. That is to say, it's the politics of ignoring our ability to make and distribute the things people need. With the banking collapse in 2008, the election of Trump in 2016, and his mourning of empty factories, and now Bernie Sanders dominating the early primaries, this is from a couple weeks ago, that era may at last be passing. A pandemic disease outbreak would only hasten this progression and force us back into the politics of production. So I think you know how I feel about this. which is, I don't think we've gotten far enough away from the politics of production in the first place,
Yeah.
with our focus on jobs and workers and that kind of thing.
Also, again, like, the politics of not paying attention to what creates wealth. Like, international trade creates international wealth and domestic wealth. People are
Right.
paying attention to exactly what creates wealth. I mean, it may not be distributed well, but that's not his point.
Yeah, I guess the question is whether the politicians are emphasizing that. Maybe he's worried that there's this kind of ideal of the American worker and this belief that the American worker is kind of making our stuff and supporting our economy. And that's something that's kind of played up in politics.
Like he thinks the politicians are not in touch with how the economy is actually working, kind of?
Right, like maybe they understand it on some level, but it's not what they play up, it's not what they emphasize.
That's
that
interesting,
kind of thing.
yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. I hadn't thought about that interpretation of the quote.
So it's the idea of, we still have this story we tell about workers producing everything, but really it's all coming from China, right? And he's saying that's dangerous, and the fact that China is shut down is going to snap us back into realizing what it actually takes to produce things, and it's not the kinds of work and stuff that people are doing now in the American economy, something like that.
Seems like a weird thing. I mean, I would think if they're not realizing it's coming from China, it would help them realize that.
Yeah.
Well, since Africa is really poor, will they die? Will the continent die off or something?
Since Africa is really poor, will who die off?
Like the citizens of the countries, because they can't buy what is it? The Tamiflu or whatever it is.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Since they don't have the resources to combat the virus itself.
I don't think that they would. I mean, Ebola was a lot more deadly, and it was in Africa, and it didn't
Right.
kill off the entire continent.
Well, Ebola was so deadly that it had a hard time spreading,
Yeah.
was the thing, because it killed off the hosts.
I think it could be really
Yeah.
bad in a place without the resources to fight it. I think it would.
Yeah.
I don't think it has the death rate to say that it would kill off the entire.
Yeah, it wouldn't kill off
Continent.
it wouldn't kill off all the people, but they might have a higher mortality rate
Yeah.
in places that don't have the resources
Which
to
is a
deal with
problem.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of people are worried about that.
Yeah. Alex is on there. Hey, Alex.
Hey, Alex. Good to see you.
Talking about coronavirus,
Yeah.
the
Nick,
usual.
Nick just left, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He's still here, just went to the bathroom.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, anyone have any more comments on this quote?
No, I'll start to curb my attitude about this guy.
Your
I
attitude
need to
about
curb it, I think.
you got to curb your
I got to. I'm
Yeah.
giving him too much help.
Yeah,
Uh,
I just remember
yeah.
we keep talking about affluence politics, and I'm not sure that that's what Galbraith actually meant. I haven't read Galbraith's
Yeah.
Affluent Society, but Googling it, I'm okay, so it's he talks about this affluence of sort of private production consumption and how we're not investing enough in public stuff,
Mhm.
and so it's okay, yeah, there are problems there about discrimination and a lot of different stuff. But I was okay, but it doesn't feel like it tracks with what argument this guy is making.
Mm.
And obviously I'm only reading Wikipedia articles and stuff.
Yeah, that's
So
interesting.
I get the sense that Galbraith was aspirational. He was realizing that we have resources and we could be doing better with them. That kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's there's a Sparks Notes kind of thing that is the contradictions of the affluent society, unrivaled prosperity alongside
For
No,
this.
I like this. I think it's an interesting article to
Yeah.
discuss. Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. I hadn't thought about this angle in terms of redundancy of production or that kind of
Right. It felt it felt unlike a lot of the other articles that are out there, and something that we could really kind of connect up to with basic income.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's great.
Yeah.
I like it. I just,
All right. All right. You ready for the next one?
Yeah.
Regardless, the end of affluence politics means focusing on whether medicine is on shelves, not bitter disputes over bloated and wasteful hospital and insurance billing departments. It means caring about bureaucratic competence in government and accuracy in media, not because these are nice things to have, but because they are necessary to avoid immense widespread suffering. It means understanding that pharmaceutical mergers that benefit shareholders while while laying off scientists are destructive, not just because they are unfair, but because they make us less resilient to disease. Shareholders, as it turns out, also have lungs. Finally, it means recognizing that wealth, real wealth, is not defined by accounting games on Wall Street, but the ability to meet the needs of our own people.
But, oh, wait a second.
So I think he's trying to like distinguish between a lot of things that are very much interconnected with each other.
I guess I was thinking he kind of did a turn in his arguments here.
Yeah.
Because, like, now this almost sounds like what Elizabeth was
Yeah,
talking about. Like, it almost sounds like the issue of, like, you know, dollars are happening, but, like, distribution of goods is not happening. Which doesn't have to do with whether you're getting your goods from China or anywhere else. I guess I find this, each sentence is also a little bit different, but I guess it doesn't seem that similar to his argument before.
Right, because first he says, like right next to each other, he says that we shouldn't be worried about bitter disputes over bloated and wasteful hospital and insurance billing departments. And then he says it means caring about bureaucratic competence.
Right, which is
So
actually really
like,
important
right.
for efficient operation of things. So I don't know why he said the other thing in the other sentence.
Right, I mean, like the reason why we have bitter fights over bloated, wasteful hospital and insurance billing departments is because we care about bureaucratic competence. Right?
Yeah.
And bureaucrats are centralized in certain locations, so that doesn't make sense in this circumstance to begin with.
What?
Bureaucrats are like centralized in like
Well, the bureaucrats aren't going to go to work either.
Yeah.
yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I suppose you have the bureaucrats, which are actual people, and you have bureaucracy, which is at a higher kind of more abstract level.
I guess what I'm getting from this paragraph overall is like an emphasis on like, oh, how something like coronavirus helps us recognize or become more conscious of the real consequences of having a good system or a bad system in all sorts of different ways. But that doesn't seem like a difference of kind from how we usually do things, maybe just a difference of degree. So what I mean by that is like, I think people are already concerned about freedom of speech or like good media because they think it has real consequences.
Yeah.
Maybe those consequences are like heightened right now. But they still think it has good, important consequences for who you elect and thus like the policies you have and thus people's well-being. And like, I think we already care about widespread suffering coming from inaccurate media or incompetent government. And this is just something that highlights it. It doesn't seem like a shift to a different mindset to say that we start to care about these kinds of consequences.
Well, I think he's trying to, I'm imagining he's trying to make his point, or my point, that we're all poor people now for a while. And so we don't care about future cost to medical insurance. We care about not dying.
Like the more rudimentary things. Yeah.
And in this way, we have immediate needs, severe immediate needs, just like poor people do.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And so we're all sort of skipping over policy arguments, and we're just trying to get our food and medicine.
That's interesting.
I like that take.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. Yeah.
So on the live stream, Goy Lundy 1970 says, with a low infection rate, 3% internationally, if I recall, are healthy people overreacting? So I don't think the infection rate is 3%. I think
that might be the number of people each person gives it to who's infected. No, it wouldn't be 3%. It's like 3 people.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there's data.
I think there's a 3% mortality rate if you are infected. So if you're a healthy person, so a lot of healthy people are going to get infected. If you're a healthy person and you get infected, the danger is that even if you end up ultimately being okay, you might spread it to other people who are not as healthy and are more high risk for dying.
Also, I think most people are pretty worried about something that gives them a 3% chance of dying in the next year, especially younger people who aren't expecting to die in the next year. Like that's a pretty high rate, I would say. I speaking as a person, for me, that doesn't seem like something I shouldn't be worried about. Maybe you have a different risk preference. person that asked that question.
Yeah. So Alex says, because of exponential growth without action, it will spread to 20 to 60% of the population. We need to flatten the curve. So this is the idea that if everybody gets infected at once, we will overload the healthcare system.
Yeah.
Whereas if the same number of people get infected, even if it's 70% of people get COVID-19, but if they get it over a period of time, then we're not going to necessarily overload our healthcare capacity.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like the biggest thing that I think we're trying to do right now is to kind of slow it down and spread it out, flatten
There's
the curve.
other really strong effects, like if we're able to come up with better treatments or a vaccine, like all of these things that slow it down.
Well, they actually have a vaccine that might work, but it would cost a ton. So it's not going to be evenly distributed.
Yeah, so things like that are like bringing that production cost down, or I mean those are maybe secondary effects to overloading the health system, but also very important.
I mean, even if we came up with no new medical technology, it's still good to slow it down.
Yeah, definitely. I was just adding to what you were saying that that kind of thing is also important.
Yep.
And the difference between 20 and 60% is also important. Like there's a lot of things there that I think are worth working on. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone have any more thoughts on this one before we get to the?
Let's get to the last.
To the last
I feel
quote.
like we've never gotten through all the quotes.
We have before, but
Oh, have we? Maybe.
We have. So Avinash says there is an issue of healthy people hoarding necessary medical equipment like masks, which means that hospitals have a shortage of things like masks to give to people who really need it.
Yeah.
So I think that is an issue, and that's something we were talking about at the beginning, like people panic buying, all of the hand sanitizer and toilet paper and all of that stuff. Yeah.
Yep.
And face masks. Okay, last quote. As Richmond Federal Reserve Bank President Tom Barkin recently put it, central banks can't come up with vaccines. It's time to get ready for what that implies. So, I think the basic point is here that we need to do real actual stuff, and the answer to this is not just tweaking around stuff with money and the financial markets and the economy and stuff like that. I would push back on that a little bit and say, kind of what we were talking about, that this is a real thing that we have to face. We don't also want it to trigger
more problems.
A financial collapse or economic turmoil and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and also like in general, I guess I find his arguments kind of difficult. Maybe it's just the way I interpret them, because they could mean a lot of different things. And here, for example, like a good banking system in a country or in a world does have influence on whether you produce vaccine. It's indirect, but it has to do with funding, the formation of companies and hospitals, and it's not like it's irrelevant just because it's not directly doing the production.
Yeah, the real productive economy depends on the financial system being functional, right? So that includes the production of the stuff we need to address a pandemic. Yeah.
But maybe the point that he's getting at that I'm more used to thinking about is the point you make, which is we kind of overblow that sector to get the real production stuff happening. So it's bigger than it needs to be.
My guess is that he's not thinking in as much detail as I do, or he's not kind of distinguishing necessarily between, fiscal policy and monetary policy, and he's kind of we're worrying about money in general, whereas there's actual real stuff that needs to be happening. But it's all connected. I would say that we, overstimulate the financial sector, and that prevents us from, getting the most out of our economy, getting the most out of our money.
Yeah.
But I think that's a slightly different thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Avinash says basic income in specific would be fantastic for a pandemic-like symptom because it reduces the urge of infected people to show up at jobs. Yeah, this is something we brought up earlier.
Yeah, it's a great point.
Carl was bringing this up on Saturday, where he used to deliver pizzas and he was sick and he called in sick and they're like, no, you have to come in and work.
Right, and he's like,
He's like, okay, that's the only way to keep my job. But, he's now sick and he's delivering your pizzas. So one of the jokes we made was maybe during coronavirus, don't order as many pizzas.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the gig economy tanks.
Oh, yeah.
And the gig economy tanks, yeah. Yeah, that's what Alex said. So many gig economy workers won't get income. Basic income can fill the gap. Yeah, and this is an example of, gig economy workers won't get as much work, but that's because not as many people want to ride around in Ubers anymore, right? So that doesn't mean that they should necessarily lose their income that they would have, it's not causing, there's not a reduction in capacity, at least directly from that, that should warrant everybody losing their incomes. There's other problems with capacity caused by this, but,
That's right.
but
So
not
I
just
think
that.
maybe before you got here, Alex, we were talking a little bit about that too, like how the income disruption that comes from these things becomes a bigger problem than it would need to be just based on like the actual productive hit.
Right.
And this is a good example of that.
Right. Yeah, we were talking about, is it a demand shock? Is it a supply shock? It's depending on what you're looking at. It could be more of one, more of the other, and then it affects people's incomes as well. So it's all kind of
that can kind of like spiral.
There's not only shortages, but there's oversupply of some things, oversupply of airline flights, and stuff like and Uber rides. So
there are actually like airline flights with like 5 people on them instead of 200.
Right. Yeah. There's actually some airlines that are flying basically empty flights, and they're doing it. So you've heard about this? Yeah. They're doing it because if they don't do it, they might lose their spot at the airports. So they just have to keep flying these planes in order to,
so they're like using up all of that fuel. Because obviously because of people that I follow on Twitter, someone had like screenshotted this and tweeted it being like, capitalism is definitely the most efficient way to distribute resources.
That's funny. I wonder why they don't just change or suspend that rule at the airports.
That would be a good idea. I hope they do that. That would be nice.
That would be good. I don't know.
Be like, everybody you can keep your gates and everything until, this whole thing blows over. And then
because that's, I mean, obviously there's inertia to these things, but that's pretty wasteful.
Well, for parking spaces in Boston, if you just put some lawn furniture in the space, everybody knows.
There you go. Yeah, exactly. Just put some stuff in the spot at the airport.
So they should do that,
Yeah,
Just
exactly.
get a traffic code.
Put
it in front of the gate.
It has to have their friends stand there for a while. It's in the spot. Yeah, exactly.
So we're getting to the end here.
I actually don't even agree. Not only do I not agree with anything else in the article, I don't agree with the last sentence. Central banks can't come up with vaccines. Well, central banks can't. Well, there was a coronavirus vaccine, except then the money ran out, so it wasn't tested. And they never figured out how to manufacture it, so it cost a fortune. But that's because the money ran out, because the government or people with money lost interest, and Big Pharma had no interest.
Right.
And I'm a little disappointed that both SARS and MERS were coronaviruses. So we had, 10 or 20 years of warning for this, but we didn't basically come up with a Defense Department, a Pentagon, to prepare for the next pandemic.
Right.
And the Defense Department, I make that analogy because you put in, hundreds of billions of dollars to defend the country, but you don't use most of it, and you kind of hope you never use any of it.
Right.
So, that kind of defense insurance, the public is already on board with that. So they could have just done that for pandemics also.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. You're not going to come up with vaccines if you don't have the funding.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm totally with you, Steve. I have the same issue with that.
I'm going to go around and get final thoughts here. Bethany?
Yeah, well, I think there were a lot of ways we articulated, maybe in the first half of the discussion, about how a basic income would help with this. And so I just think it's interesting, like the different ways, reducing the shock to the economy, obviously, more like keeping it to only what it needs to be, but then also the ways that poverty actually makes the pandemic, or like makes disease pandemics worse. I think those are kind of 2 big categories.
Yeah.
Good discussion.
Yeah. Any more thoughts, Steve?
I have seen just in the past couple of days a whole lot of people including the president, he's not suggesting UBI, he is suggesting relief for regular people, financial relief for regular people. A
Yeah.
whole lot of other people are suggesting it was basically UBI just in the past couple of days, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
I haven't found, somewhere there must be our version of Herbert Hoover saying that there shouldn't be any relief for anybody and everybody deserved it and the market is working fine like that, but I haven't found that yet either. There are some things you could complain about, like can rural people complain that this is really a city problem, a high-density living problem, and that, that's these city people made that lifestyle choice and now they're reaping what they sow. Or they could say, well, some people have said that the city people are also the global travel people. And it's all this global travel, which is not absolutely necessary, and look what it's brought us. So you could complain about that, and you could consider changing that, but I haven't heard anybody really complaining about that.
Yeah. Elizabeth?
Let's see. Good conversation. I was thinking about sort of stuff that I've seen on Twitter about being like the sort of we could choose to fund the stuff if we want. That some restaurants be like, oh yeah, we're gonna give like full sick leave, full paid sick leave to our like restaurant workers and stuff. And it's like, okay, so like you could have done that all along. Like you've now chosen to, because it's like, oh, there's this social pressure because it's like, oh, a pandemic, and so like we look like jerks if we don't do this, or we want to be seen as leaders to be like, oh, look at this great thing that we're doing. And so people come to our restaurant and like the one time a week that you go to a restaurant, and they're sort of like, oh yeah, so you could have chosen to do this beforehand. Like you didn't have to essentially force people to come to work sick previously by being like, well, if you're home sick, like too bad, you're an hourly employee, you don't get paid. And it's like, oh, now you can provide this. And that feels like sort of a microcosm of the argument that you often make about like, we could afford to do this basic income that we choose not to. And there's been other stuff about sort of government intervention around, not necessarily around funding, but around being like, okay, we're going to demand, but I think there has been some stuff around like telling insurers, like, oh, you have to provide certain levels of care or whatever. And so it's sort of like, oh, okay, like the government could do these pro-social things if it wanted to. It just mostly hasn't chosen to.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, the thing about rural communities is that they have to travel like 30 miles or whatever to get to the nearest hospital. While in the city, you can just go to the nearest subway station and there's a hospital there. So it's a lot more efficient allocation of resources.
Yeah. So I think it's true that as a result of this, we're going to start implementing some things that we should have already had. And I think it's reasonable to complain that we didn't already have those things.
Yeah.
It's reasonable for me to complain that we didn't already have a basic income.
Before the Great Depression.
Like I was arguing in the last session that this is an opportunity to implement a basic income.
Yeah. So Jay Gannon says, come on, this is a bioengineered novel virus, possibly released as a financial weapon. So that's a nice conspiracy theory there. We'll see if that bears out, I suppose. But I don't think that's. You could just as. This is something that can happen. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be planned by anyone.
I actually sometimes think about how interesting it is that this kind of thing doesn't happen more often.
Yeah.
I don't know the details of why it should happen or shouldn't, but I mean, we do live in a highly globally interconnected, dense world.
Yeah.
Financial weapons of mass destruction are easy to make.
Yeah.
You don't have to,
You don't have to engineer a virus for that. All you have to do is like short the right instruments or something. Yeah.
And there you could have like with mosquitoes. They transport tires with mosquitoes in them all the time.
Okay.
And the mosquitoes have like dengue and whatever
Oh, I see.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is remarkable that this kind of thing doesn't happen more often, and I hope that it stays that way, and also that we are prepared,
we're prepared.
for
Which
the next
certainly
time,
could be.
which
Yeah.
hopefully won't happen.
Yeah.
Yes. So this is a good discussion. Unfortunately, for obvious reasons, this is going to be our last in-person Boston Basic Income discussion for at least a while. Next week, I haven't added the event for next week because I haven't quite figured it out yet, but what we're going to try to do is have an online discussion. We're thinking about doing Zoom. I do have the topic picked out. The topic is full employment. So we will have some sort of something next week on full employment. It may or may not be live streamed on YouTube, but if it's not live streamed, it will be recorded and posted to
But
YouTube
also, like,
afterwards.
people who are currently on the live stream could be on the actual Zoom.
Yes, so if you're on the live stream right now, you could be on the actual Zoom call, and then maybe this is a blessing in disguise because now everybody has a more equal opportunity to participate in the conversation. You don't have to be relegated to, a chat box on the side of a screen that we're all looking at. So we'll see how it goes. Boston Basic Income is great. We have great discussions, and I'm looking forward to seeing what this turns into.
Yeah.
So thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'm there.